Welcome, everyone, to what I think will be an absolutely fascinating session this afternoon. We have the privilege of hosting two of India's most perceptive and renowned social scientists who hardly need an introduction to this audience. One is an economist, Arvind Subramanian, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, former chief economic advisor to the government of India. He has also held positions at Brown University, Harvard University, and the International Monetary Fund. In addition to his considerable scholarship, he is, in my view, one of the most gifted writers in the economics profession, although cynics will say that that's not a very high bar to cross. Writing lucid commentaries for the New York Times, the Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, Business Standard, and Project Syndicate, among others. The other is a political scientist, Devesh Kapur, currently the Starr Foundation Professor of South Asian Studies at the School of Advanced International Studies of Johns Hopkins University. His previous academic homes include UT Austin, the University of Pennsylvania, and Harvard. He is also a prolific and internationally acclaimed commentator, writing for The Guardian, the FT, Business Standard, and Project Syndicate, and he's particularly and justly celebrated for his work on the Indian diaspora and the impact of skilled immigration both on source and host countries. Together, they've written a book which could not have been written by an economist alone or a political scientist alone. A Sixth of Humanity is absolutely magisterial in scope and ambition, aiming at nothing less than a narrative history of India's development since independence. And they look at development in a very sweeping way, of which economic growth is only one aspect, albeit an important aspect. Let me say some things about their book that particularly appeal to me. One recurrent theme, which to me is quite convincing, is the theme of India as a precocious democracy, not just in the sense of doing things early, but in the sense of doing things not in the usual order. So universal franchise, the right to vote, came at a much earlier stage of development in India compared to the West or compared to East Asia at low levels of literacy and per capita income. Or take structural transformation. In most countries, there is a progress from agriculture to manufacturing to services. In India, somewhat mysteriously, we seem to have largely skipped the middle stage of manufacturing. In education, there is often a prior focus on establishing universal literacy and providing basic schooling. In India, instead, the focus was on producing world-class elite institutions of higher education. And all of this was happening not against the backdrop of some universal, monolithic, unitary state, but in a vigorous federal polity where a lot of very important policy decisions were being made at the state level, not at the central level. So what were the consequences of this precociousness? We're about to find out. We are also very lucky to have with us today a couple of very distinguished discussants. Dr. Shankar Acharya is an honorary professor at Acharya. He was the longest-serving chief economic advisor to the government of India and one of the key architects of India's economic liberalization in the mid-1980s and early 1990s. Dr. Amita Batra is one of India's foremost experts in international trade, a professor at JNU, and a former senior fellow at Acharya. She has also held positions at the University of Edinburgh and IIMA. So many thanks to all our distinguished guests for their participation and to you, the audience, for showing up for what I'm sure will be a thrilling 1 hour. Devesh and Arvind, over to you. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Shekhar, for that very kind introduction. Thank you, Shekhar, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. I on behalf of Arvind and myself, I also want to thank Shankar, who's been our guidepost for so many decades, and Professor Batra. Thank you so much for being here. So what I'm going to do is to give you a sense about the book and some of the key findings, and then Arvind will sort of discuss them more. So as Shekhar said, the book is interdisciplinary. That is because we feel that development is a very complex process. A young country, when it thinks about economic development, it has to simultaneously think about state and nation building, and also about transforming society. And each of these, of course, interact with each other. The approach we took was we were determined to go into this with very limited priors. And so we put together data sets across a wide range of variables. The source of the data was reading through about 3,000 official government reports, which also helped us to understand why certain choices were made when they were made, rather than looking at it with the hindsight of with the benefit of hindsight. It's very easy to be wise much later on, but unless one understands the constraints that the policymakers made at that particular time, judgments can be quite facile. Besides that, a distinctive part of the book is it has a very comparative approach, comparative over time, comparative over space across India, comparative over other developing countries, especially China, but also comparative with what we call development time. There's no point in comparing India with the US right now because it's a much richer country. But it could make much more sense comparing India with the US when the US had a similar per capita income what India has now, which would be the late 19th century. And that's what we call development time. So these are the broad sort of features sort of underlying how we wrote this book. So the first thing that we sort of begin is something that Shekhar talked about, was a very distinctive path that India took. So basically, there are sort of three major models of development. There is the quintessential American, European model, where the franchise expanded as economic growth happened. So they were concurrent. A second model is East Asia, exemplified by South Korea, where economic development comes first. And once it becomes middle income, you have the democracy and the franchise. A third model is, of course, China, massive economic development, no franchise. And the fourth, which is very, very unique, is the Indian model, where the franchise, universal franchise, comes at extremely low levels of literacy and per capita income. And to show that, this is sort of some comparative countries, and it tells you the income at which they gave full franchise, and also the gap between full and male franchise. We know that in most of these countries, women got the franchise much, much later on. Now remember, at the time of independence, India was an extremely patriarchal society. Not that it's not now, but at that time it was even more so. So the fact that they decided to give it in a way that most European countries and the US did not was also very, very special about the Indian case. So besides this, some other distinctive features some were contingent. One of the most contingent early choices was because of the extreme chaos around partition, was the decision to go for greater centralization. Some of them reflected the zeitgeist of the times. Planning state-led industrialization, that was not unique to India. That was what was around the world. The Soviet Union's success in World War II, its rapid growth, that was seen as what you could achieve with planning. And it's not surprising, from Brazil to India, many countries that became independent, or many developing countries, this was a widespread choice. But what was distinctive was the decision, A, on universal franchise at such low levels of income, and also affirmative action for marginalized groups. So we've seen affirmative action in other countries like Malaysia or South Africa, but that's for the majority group. What was distinctive about India, it was like for minorities. And the third was not to build the nation in the Western model, single religion, single language. So these were some of the choices that were made, and what the book then looks at, what were the consequences of these choices. So one of the consequences, we argue, was that what India avoided. India stands out in just how low levels of mass violence. And I want to distinguish mass violence from the day-to-day violence that occurs. Of course, you open any Indian newspaper, there'll be lots of examples of violence. But those are, we want to think about mass violence as what happens in wars, revolutions, civil wars, where millions, tens of millions of people are killed, right? So the American Civil War kills 2% of the US population. If something like that were to happen in India, that would be 30, 35 million people. That's the scale we are talking about, right? So India, what it succeeded through the democracy, it created order in the sense of avoiding mass violence. It also sort of, oh, we don't have a slide. So what we also show it, it also avoided extreme economic disorder. And how we show that is comparing hyperinflation in India to other developing countries. And India had much lower levels of inflation on average than, say, a Turkey, a Brazil, a Argentina. And we argue that democracy played a central role for India to avoid both mass violence and extreme economic disorder. Now, when we think about building a nation, one of the key ways is to try to attenuate deep-seated structural inequalities. And we know that one of the biggest ones was around caste. You can think of it around region or religion. We've just, for illustrative purposes, used gender. And, you know, if you just see the second last row, which is on maternal mortality, it's an extraordinary how high it was around the time that India became independent. So it's not that India is now exceptionally good. It's just that substantial progress has been made. That doesn't mean there's not a further way to go. But when you see how bad it was in the past, right? Similarly, if you look at primary education, the percentage of females per 100 males, it was extremely low, but there's been gradual progress, which now has extended to higher education as well. Now, of course, nation building, equality can be around social indicators, but also around income. And, you know, there's a lot of talk of inequality in India. We know there are numerous ways in which you measure wealth inequality, income inequality, all of that. We've used a very different type of metric just for illustrative purposes, which is the number of billionaires by country relative to a country's per capita income, right? And you can see that relative to how low income India is on average, it has vastly greater number of like billionaires than other similar countries had when they were at India's level of income. And that, I think, is sort of illustrative of the extreme income and wealth inequalities at the very top. Now, when we look at state and nation building, we often think of issues around centralization and decentralization. So the usual story is that India is centralized. When we think of that, we think of the relationship between Delhi and the states. So the relationship between tier 1 and tier 2 of the government. When you look at the three largest countries in the world, China, India, and the US, China and the US have very different political regimes, right? One is communist, one is democratic and capitalist. But they are very similar in that most government employees are at the federal and the local level. India is extremely centralized at tier 2 relative to tier 3 because most employees are actually at the state level. And one of the consequences of this, we argue, is that many of the things the Indian state fails at, primary education, public health, these sanitation, water, these are local public goods. And local public goods are provided by local governments. And local governments in India, compared to US, China, are extremely weak relative to tier 2. And that's something which surprised us. When we looked at state building, again, there are different ways. I'm just showing you one of the ways state building occurs. So state building requires, a state is a physical space. And state building requires weaving a physical tapestry of connectivity. In British India, that occurred through the telegraph and the railways. Independent India, initially, public investment was much more in state-owned enterprises, not in public infrastructure. So many of the rivers of India actually had very few bridges. And for instance, Bihar, undivided Bihar, 100 million people, the Ganga bisects it, had one bridge for the entire state till the 80s. All of the Northeast, where the Brahmaputra is about 1,500 kilometers, had one bridge. What you see is the nature of public investment begins to change, and you see a rapid growth in, and of course, if you don't have a bridge across a major river, it'll affect commerce, trade, all the things that matter for market integration. So state building, at least by this measure, sharply changes from the 1990s or onwards, because public investment, the composition of it, begins to change. Another way that economic historians have looked at the state is whether it is present. So we know that one of the reasons the Maoist movement has been so strong in central India is there has been no state presence there. You know, literally, there are no roads, there's no connectivity. So the three ways that, say, people who looked at the US and the expansion of the state in the US in the 19th century were, is there a post office? Is there a public school? And is there a police, station? So we tried to look at a sort of a few more indicators, and you gradually see the presence of the Indian state in rural India becoming more and more. Unfortunately, we had to use only the 2011 census because the next census is not yet out, but still you see pretty rapid changes. Now, one of the outcomes that we looked at and the reasons is we looked at human capital outcomes, and it's illustrative of where progress has been achieved and where progress is lagging. So on the left-hand side is you see on infant mortality, And India's percentile rank was 74 in the 50s. It deteriorated by the late 1980s to 76. And then gradually investments in this more provision of public goods, its rank has improved, but it's still only at the 63rd percentile. In contrast, if you look at stunting, the progress has been much less, right? Its rank was 94. It barely improved 30 years later by the 80s to 93. And now it's again modestly improved, but it's much less than even Bangladesh. And this sort of phenomenon where India has sharply improved on enrollment in schooling, but not learning, sharply improved in life expectancy. So in other words, mortality, but not morbidity, which continues to be very high. So one of the things that we look at in the book is why has it improved on certain indicators, but lagged in other human capital indicators? So I'll turn it over to Arvind now.
While I'm setting my timer so that I don't bore you, I want to echo what Devesh said in thanking Shekhar for inviting us, all of you for coming, Professor Batra also for joining the panel. And I have to say, particularly honored that one of my most illustrious predecessors, Shankar, is here. So it's a particular honor to have Shankar as well. Just to take what Devesh said going forward, there are, I think, a few themes in the book. One of them, Shekhar alluded to, precociousness, which is irregular sequencing. We spoke about democracy before development. And then also what Shekhar mentioned. So if there's a political precociousness, there's also an economic precociousness, which you see in this chart. The red line is India compared with, East Asian countries. Too much agriculture for too long, too little formal manufacturing for too long, and too much high-skilled services too early in development. So we call this prolonged ruralization, premature deindustrialization, and precocious servicification is one way of capturing that. But there's also an international dimension to this precociousness. As Shekhar said, Devesh has done some amazing work on the diaspora, and the chart on the left draws upon that work. What it shows is that on the y-axis, what is the income of various migrant groups in the US compared to their per capita GDP in the origin country from where these come from. And you can see that by far, the Indian migrant earns the most. And relative to, it's about a factor of 32, 35 relative to. So the thing is that this is export of all the talent, or you might say hemorrhaging or bleeding of talent via migration. But then there's the darker counterpart to this precociousness, which is on the y-axis, which is on the right-hand side. The y-axis measures for a group of developing countries, what is your share of global exports in low-skilled products, because that's what poorer countries should export. And on the x-axis, what is your share of the global labor force? And in some ways, I would say this is the development failure of India, because as you can see, China and India are complete outliers. China roughly accounts for 22 of the global labor force and occupies about 40 to 50% of global export market share. India, the same share of the labor force, but 3-4% of global export market share. So the economic opportunities from exploiting low-skilled labor through trade, in a way that high-skilled talent was able to exploit through globalization and migration, India has shortchanged that. And in some ways, that red line, the gap between actual and potential, represents all the squandered development opportunities, especially employment for low-skilled labor. And the theme of precociousness also runs through in terms of policy choices. India did well, and Devesh mentioned this, state capitalism before public goods like, infrastructure, basic health and education, physical capital before human capital, and of course, even within capital, on education, obsession with early on with population control and disease control to the neglect of sanitation, public health, etc. So this precociousness runs through the book. Another theme that runs through the book is what we would call my Bapism, a kind of ideology that is shared across the spectrum. It's not right or left. It's kind of this, default Indian society. When it wants something done, it defaults and says the state should provide it, irrespective and despite the fact that the state has consistently failed in so many things. So we put together data since 1970 to today on all the central public sector undertakings, and similarly for some state public undertakings. And what you find here is that if you compare the actual rate of return with some benchmark, either the GSEC rate or the private prime lending rate, this central public sector units consistently underperformed, except for brief periods in the growth era. If you think central public enterprises were bad, state public sector was just infinitely worse. And this kind of a theme that we runs through the book, where we say anything that the center does badly, the states do much worse. And this is an example of that, but it's true for other. In the case, this is electricity undertakings, not just low returns, but consistently negative returns with huge costs. So in the book, we put together, Devesh and I, what are the opportunity costs of this socialist business? Had a decent rate of return be earned, how much more would the Indian state have got? And we calculate that the total cost just for central and state public enterprises is 1.25% to 2.5% of GDP every year. To give that texture, state governments, had their enterprises made a decent return, every year they could have doubled their expenditure at least on health, for example, and the center could have almost doubled its expenditure on infrastructure. So the costs were huge, and the my Bapism comes in because the Indian state knew this, consistently report after report said it, and yet was not able to address it. And we think partly it's this my Bapist ideology. And so there's also another theme that runs the book. When Devesh says we read 3,000 reports, Devesh read 2,995 of them, and I read remaining 5. But what that shows is that this is the Indian state was remarkably self-reflecting. It was reasonably and frequently self-flagellating, but it was rarely self-correcting. And this is an example of that. Consistent negative returns, we're aware of it, but we're unable to exit it. The same thing happens in banking, public sector banking, which, Vaivuredi famously called joint family banking. Again, for the first time, we show, the return on assets for public and private enterprises. The benchmark of 1% comes from Warren Buffett. And you can see that public sector banks consistently earn below the benchmark and also below India's private sector banks. And again, and of course, in this case, the big cost is how it crowded out lending for development. The last 3 columns, what is the share of GDP credit that was lent for commercial lending? While it did go up over time from 8.6 to 25, look at how much the Chinese and Koreans, how much credit they lent to the private sector. So this crowding out. And of course, the thing we say is that here, exit didn't happen consciously, it happened by default. Here you see the share of public sector banks in credit and deposits. It comes down sharply over time. And something similar happens also to public sector enterprises, that their share of the economy comes down, not because of conscious privatization or exit, but because the private sector grows, as it were. Now, I have, just to make sure. Yeah, I have, say 10 minutes. So one of the things is the primacy of economic growth. And I'm going to read, rather than, a small snippet from the book. Growth or equity, Jagdish Bhagwati or Amartya Sen. Indian development policy has been mired in this dichotomy, perhaps not in extreme caricatured opposition, but certainly in terms of relative emphasis, whether to focus on increasing the economic pie or on improving social outcomes affecting particularly the poor and the vulnerable. But this opposition is overdone not just for the obvious reasons that growth requires both. It is also, this book will shows that the opposition is especially misleading in India, where democracy has been precocious, where society has been fractured, and where state action commensurately constricted. Growth gained a surprising causal primacy, mostly for good. And we show how it reduced poverty and changed economic lives, how the dynamic of education changed because of growth. And irony of ironies, it's the neoliberal state because of growth that became the caring social welfare state. And Devesh has other work, excellent work, which shows how it facilitated social change. And of course, it transformed India. So we read, growth was not just grist, grease, glue, and getaway. Above all, it was the acceleration of growth since 1980 that fomented the revolution of rising expectations, which allowed India to trace the Napoleon arc from civilizational diffidence and woundedness to mutinous aspiration for its 1.4 billion people. So growth was actually very important, but growth also led to divergent growth, which altered the course on fiscal federalism and, of course, also accelerated internal migration. So this is a chart that shows, divergence between the states. What the chart plots is at each point in time, what is the per capita GDP of a state relative to the national average? And what you find is that 60s compressed, 80s a bit of widening, but thereafter it explodes. So and you see that shaded area, there is no missing middle of mediocrity. It's just very good or very bad. And the way to illustrate how the magnitude of this divergence is this chart where we show, if you start the clock in 1980 and plot all the countries in the world against the states of India, what you find is that 1/3 of India, of the Indian states, the South, Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Haryana, they grew almost as rapidly as China and for as long. Think of that. So we can no longer say, why didn't India grow as much as China? It's more, why didn't 2/3 of India grow as much as the 1/3 of India that in fact grew as fast as China? So it produces a different spin on things. The other thing, so there are surprises on growth. And, for this audience, I wish I could go into it more, but I think I will be brief here. One of the contributions is to kind of completely reread Indian history, where we think was completely diagnosed. So the planning era was not import substitution. Happy to develop on that. It was actually an era of scarcity because the domestic private sector was basically stymied and taxed. And slightly underachieved, the neoliberal growth era. India was in fact an East Asian tiger in growth and trade outcomes, export growth, 3rd largest in the world, even in manufacturing, but very un-East Asian tiger in policies. We did not do industrial policy. We did not do undervaluing the exchange rate. We just did it through liberalization. And unfortunately, very un-East Asian tiger in that there was not the same structural transformation in terms of providing employment for low-skill goods. And so there are other surprises on growth we can talk about. Other big surprise for us was, if you look at the post-1990 period when India grew very rapidly, you would think that rapid growth would give taxes and it would become a strong fiscal state. In fact, in the period 1990 to 2020, India has the highest fiscal deficit amongst comparable countries, almost double-digit every year for 35 years. And then we talk about why this happens, the Kamadhenu fiscal state, where we say that, many people, even Pranab Bardhan's great book says, oh, India has some vested interests. But what we show is that, both the downside and the upside of democracy is that it is capacious in accommodating every vested interest. On the tax side, the poor are not taxed, the middle class is not taxed, the rich is not taxed or undertaxed. Farmers, rich farmers are not taxed, property owners are not taxed, and so on. And if you look at the spending side, you will see at the central government, state government, third tier, the amount of subsidies that are given to all kinds of interest groups. And that's the kind of capacious Indian Kamadhenu, suckling all vested interests, sustaining, facilitating every manner of special pleading in India. I have 4 more minutes. Okay. So the other thing Devesh skipped over is that, in terms of nation building, transferring resources from richer parts to poorer parts is part of being one country, because you want citizens everywhere to have broadly equal access to public services. So you want to equalize government fiscal capacity across the states. What this chart shows is who were the donors and who were the beneficiaries of, in terms of fiscal transfers under the Finance Commission. So top means you get more than you contribute to the tax base. Bottom means you give more than you contribute to the tax base. 2 things noteworthy about this is that the big beneficiaries are, of course, the Hindi heartland and things, but the biggest donors are not the southern states. So although in the recent rhetoric, all the clamor and contentiousness comes from the southern states, the biggest donors are the West and Haryana. And what it means is that, therefore, the reason for this grievance is probably something other than or in addition to the fiscal problem, not just that. The other thing to note, I think, where there is some merit in the grievance of the South is that in all fiscal unions, you want transfers, but what is happening here is that the transfers have been steadily rising and against a backdrop of divergent performance, so that transfers seem to be incentivizing underperformance and penalizing overperformance, and that's the sense in which we should see the transfers. Last 2 slides. I have 2.5 minutes. GDP per capita, India 79th percentile to begin with. It deteriorates to 85th percentile by 1980, and it improves because of rapid growth after 1980. But today, India is still 66th percentile in terms of per capita GDP, which should kind of be sobering for us in terms of all these aspirations to being the superpower, et cetera, et cetera. We're still amongst the poorer states. And then in terms of Human Development Index, it is kind of even slightly worse. We began 63rd percentile. We deteriorated to 79th percentile, and today you're only the 69th percentile. So let me just read. I have 1.5 minutes. I'm going to read what the overall assessment is of India, how we conclude this. The magic and paradox of India is that it created and sustained democracy under fragile, even inhospitable conditions, and aspired to a capaciousness that allowed competing ideas and identities to flourish. These were the intrinsic achievements of democracy and nation building. The under-recognized achievement of India, which Devesh stressed, has been maintaining a modicum of economic, political, and social order, and forging a workable sense of nationhood by embracing democracy, celebrating diversity, and restoring historical disadvantage. Order and nation building owed considerably to democracy enabling representation, accommodation, and reconciliation. These were the instrumental achievements of democracy. The delayed and partial success of India was to foster economic dynamism, build a state, establish greater physical and digital connectivity, so that state building reinforced nation building, and it engaged with the world with greater purpose and confidence, though still tinged with ambivalence. The durable disappointment of India has been the inability to parlay all these achievements into better human capabilities and to break the stranglehold of a patriarchal and hierarchical society. The abiding irony of India is that democracy, which Devesh spoke about all the things that it gave, it also took back. And various ways we can talk about is that democracy enabled these disappointments. The looming tragedy of India might be that just as state building and economic progress are underway, the real achievements of democracy, order, federalism, and nation building are under threat.
Thank you very much, Devesh and Arvind. A truly fascinating tour de force. Dr. Acharya?
Well, how to run it? It's probably an impossibility theorem there somewhere. Now, I need to speak into the mic because people tell me I speak too softly. Well, first of all, thank you, Shekhar, for inviting me to be a discussant. When you asked me, barely a week ago, I readily agree with I had no idea at that time there were 700 pages that I was getting into. And so I feel it's a bit of a poisoned chalice that I was given. You can't hear me. Oh, that means I mustn't turn. I have a feeling the mics don't work unless I touch them or something like that. Okay, I'll try my best. But keep it up, Pooja. I look to you to see if sound has fallen too low. Now, this is not about the book. It's about Shekhar. As most of you know, that he took over last month, I think, as director Acharya. And as someone said, that uneasy lies the head that bears the crown or wears the crown. Now, I do hope, Shekhar, that you prove Shakespeare wrong. Anyway, welcome and good luck. I think I have a little bit of a right to say that because I've been the fifth or sixth or seventh wheel at Acharya for about 25 years. Now let's turn to the magnum opus. Well, first of all, huge congratulations. And really, it's an amazing thing you've done. And as Ram Guha says in the quote on the cover page, it's a very impressive book. I agree. I think, to me, I mean, there are many ways it's impressive, but to me, the particularly impressive way was that it brought together economics, politics, and sociology in the same weave of the book, and does it in a convincing way, in my humble opinion. I mean, it goes in the non-economic side, as someone to be mentioned, the issues of caste, patriarchy, hierarchy, probably gender. I think it's also very valuable in the way it brings to bear cross-country comparison, because those who haven't kind of been forced to do this in multilateral institutions, this is not the normal way of thinking about a country usually, especially a big country. And certainly in India, we don't do it enough. And it's always a great pleasure to see that strain coming in a major book. Arvind and Devesh, I think, in my opinion, also deserve congratulations because of their courage and their confidence that a book like this of 700 pages will be read in the age or in the Instagram. My own thought or answer, not an answer, it's a thought, is one, I think I predict that it will be treated a little bit like what happened to Gunnar Myrdal's famous Asian drama in 3 volumes. It was much referenced, but probably little read. Now, I'm not wishing that on you, but I wouldn't be surprised if that happened. By the way, since from a scholar's point of view, I think the 2 things you're interested in are referencing. That'll happen because every development scholar, teacher, student is going to need to show it on their bookshelf, which is how I got Asian drama on my bookshelf when I was 25 or 22 or whatever it was. So something like that might happen. But
The other thing I think you are probably interested in a little bit is sales, and that will go for the same reason. You'll sell a lot. But if you had a way of measuring how much of it was actually read and absorbed, luckily that particular way doesn't exist. Otherwise, you might be a bit disappointed. Anyway, let me give some, I only have a few minutes and I've probably already taken too much time. And I apologize ahead to Amita, who's coming last. And I hope that the chair will, if I go over, don't take it away from her. Because that's certainly would be a reflection of patriarchy, gender bias, and everything else. So you stop me by all means. Now, here are just sort of a few random comments, because that's all I can do, as you can well understand in this. Despite all that's been said and important, I still feel that in some ways it underplays the untapped benefits of trade, globalization, and exports. And from my own opinion, and including my time as CA, so I'm guilty. I think our policy reforms was in the 90s and the 2000s, when things were going reasonably well. Our policy reforms were too slow and half-hearted in this area, frankly. I mean, there's a lot of instances in the book. They're not necessarily addressing this point of view, but I think that's true. And we lost out to East Asia, and we continue to lose out to East Asia, and I predict that we will. One puzzle, which is a puzzle to me, but perhaps that's because I've stopped being a scholar and I don't work, read, or do anything much else, is that, the headcount ratio of absolute or extreme poverty. I think I may be a little bit off, but if I remember the numbers in the book, and they're mostly sourced from the World Bank, I think, drops from somewhere around 40 to 50% as a ratio in the 80s, taken loosely, to somewhere around under 10% in the 2010s. Of course, Surjit Bhalla would say you're off by a factor of 5, but I'm not going that far. So, I mean, that's remarkable, right? What is the puzzle? To my mind, the puzzle is, during these 40 years, the ratio of formal employment in total employment pretty much stays below 10%. Maybe 1 year it goes a teeny bit above, but mostly it's 8, 9%. I don't understand what's going on. I mean, people say growth gives you removal of jobs. I mean, the normal economics that I learned is that the transmission mechanism from growth to poverty alleviation is employment. But if your formal sector as a ratio isn't growing, how is it happening? And what is it that all these 90% in the informal sector all are the examples of being informal and rich? I don't believe that. I mean, visual thing doesn't tell you that. So I mean, that's a puzzle to me, and if you have if there's time and you want to answer that, either one of you, I'd be very happy. A second thought, which again has been third thought rather, you picked upon, and I got some very good slides. It is really depressing and remarkable, both, that of our almost uniformly poor performance in education, primary level, secondary level, tertiary level. I mean, yes, the tertiary level began well, but I'm not sure it's really taken off hugely. The numbers have, but the outcomes, other than they all go abroad, hasn't, in my view. And there are obviously reasons for this, and this variation. I mean, the primary and secondary level, as you yourselves note, other than I think Kerala and Himachal, it's a grim story. And every year, beautifully, the ASER report comes out, and nothing much changes. And that's been coming out for what, 20, 25 years or something like that. So it's not new, or maybe more. So why? I mean, that's, to my mind, the big why. You have a lot of reasons, but at the end of the day, I don't feel I'm totally convinced. But that may be me, not you. Fourth, penultimate point. I do like the way the book goes into and brings out the major weaknesses of the Indian state. Everything I say, by the way, varies over time and space in India. I should have said that right away. So please remember that qualification. But what I call the 4 C's, where I think Indian state, I would be happy if it was better. Competence, control, as you have pointed out, complexity in policy, and of course, corruption. And I mean, there are other things going on, of course, and you have them in your book. But how do you solve these things? I haven't a clue, pretty much. I mean, obviously, if asked to write a report, we all dutifully write a report, but that's not what I mean. Finally, the last 50 pages of this book, which is your concluding section, right? Essentially, to me, suggest a difficult future, especially given not just the pathologies and legacies of the past, but also the looming challenges of the future, which you mentioned, including the ones you mentioned, and there are others: geopolitics, technology, climate change, and demography. Thank you. Sorry, I've gone over.
Thank you, Dr. Acharya. It's a long time since I heard the name Gunnar Myrdal. One of the interesting things about him is that he actually shared a Nobel Prize with Hayek, leading to the quip that economics is the only subject where people with diametrically opposed theories can not only get Nobel Prizes in different years, but actually share one. Dr. Professor Batra?
Well, I think there's only one mic that's working, not the other one. Anyway, thank you. Thank you, Shekhar. Thank you, Acharya, for having invited me here today, given me this opportunity to comment, first to read this book and then to comment on this book, which I think is a huge task, huge ask, I would say, My congratulations, of course, to Shekhar for having taken over as Director Acharya, and my best wishes to you as well. My congratulations to the authors for having accomplished this huge task, I would say. I understand both in terms of how difficult it is to write a book. To write a book that's huge. I don't know how you got that, how you got to doing that, because for me, I think when I'm getting down to write a book, the publishers these days give you a stipulation of only so much. Big fat books are not read anymore, So one is limited in that sense, most of the times by your publisher in terms of how much can you really put in a book. So in that sense, a huge congratulations. And I think you're very lucky to have been able to put in all that you wanted to. A confession, when I was asked to comment on this book, I think there was only a week. So I haven't been able to read the entire book. But I did focus on reading a few chapters which particularly interest me. And particularly in terms of manufacturing, how India has skipped manufacturing, moved on to services, the usual growth story that we have, The comparative bit also particularly is of interest to me. I think as Dr. Acharya mentioned, rarely do we come across in Indian analysis a comparison with other economies. East Asia invariably, despite the fact in the neighborhood having done miraculously well in the 1980s, you see, I think we did not look east for a long time. And even now, I think looking east, acting east, you see, has its own limitations or has seen its own limitations. I think we need to look east more. But coming to the more substantive comment, as far as, this particular statement that you also make in one of your slides, which is that India has been like an East Asian tiger. but un-East Asian as far as policies are concerned, and you bring in both growth and trade. You know, I looked into the book, and if I've missed something, I would really like to be corrected here. But what I saw missing in this particular analysis was, you know, the focus here as far as trade is concerned is on rate of growth of exports, without looking much at what is it that was going on in trade globally at this time. There was an evolution, you see, the period that you mentioned, the 1990s, the early 2000s, you see, this is the period that you have of what we call as peak global value chain period, you know. This is the time when global trade was being led by intermediate goods. And it is those countries that participated or that had an increasing share in this lead component of global trade that benefited the most. So for us to say, you see, that we did increase our exports, yes, we did. In a few of the sectors, you see, chemicals was one predominant sector, but chemicals was not a GVC intensive sector. I think what you basically focus on is clothing, textiles and clothing, low skill intensive exports. But there too, I think this is a very, very important component that I feel the book has missed on completely, you know. I don't find a mention of intermediate goods. I don't find a mention of global value chains. I don't find a mention of trade policy in East Asia that was particularly suited to or designed to take advantage of this change that was happening in the world and in the nature of global trade. As global trade evolved, you see, in terms of intermediate goods, there were certain dynamic sectors. And these dynamic, I think the most dynamic sector when we talk about global value chains, you see, has been electronics. And it's not just, I mean, you talk about textiles and clothing and footwear and talk about low skill intensive, how Korea and Taiwan started with that. It moved on to other countries of East Asia. You know, there was Vietnam that you give another example, how these two sectors, low skill intensity sectors, you see, have moved on from labor abundant China as wages increase to labor abundant Vietnam. But you see, the important thing here is that you also had in electronics, the lowest end of the value chain moving to Vietnam, which was low skill intensive, which is where Vietnam really gained, you see. And what is it that we need to see here is not just rate of growth of our exports, you see, but as a share in terms of the rate of change that Vietnam experienced in its share in global exports in electronics, which is not something that we have. I mean, it's only this decade, you see, and it's only in the last 3-4 years that we are looking at a focus, or we have started to focus on electronics as a possibility of increasing our exports. And we're looking at how fitting into the value chain, how getting into the assembly and packaging, we've only gotten into that stage, is giving us a boost as far as our exports are concerned. So manufacturing linkages with employment, I think, you know, that came through the participation of Vietnam, or earlier even Korea and Taiwan. I mean, if you look at the early work, in fact, I mean, while I was reading this book and I happened to look at something, I mean, I was just trying to look through some other papers. I came across a 1970 Bela Balasa paper that talks about, you know, global value chain integration on parts and components trade for, I mean, he was, of course, talking about Korea and Taiwan at that time, but also talks about backward integration in terms of global value chains. And backward integration is low skill intensity, labor abundant stages of production, which is what has given, whether it was Korea, Taiwan earlier, you see, or it was was China later, and then Vietnam most recently, you see, this is what has given these countries the advantage in terms of having an intensity of manufacturing and manufacturing exports as a share in their total exports and as a share of global merchandise exports. We've missed out on that. I mean, if we say our exports grew, yes, they did. You see, we crossed 1% of global share in around 2008. But then for the next decade, we've stayed around 2% the entire decade, continue to be so this decade too. You see, so this particular aspect, you see, of manufacturing sector, you see, how is it that manufacturing specialization and competitiveness really came about in the other emerging market economies, particularly the comparator set that you've picked up, which is East Asia. I think that's where the answer to a puzzle that India has experienced, you see, we've been talking about having skipped the second stage as far as our growth trajectory is concerned, precisely or majorly for this particular reason. My second thing, in the same context, the second comment is with respect to trade policy. There's almost no mention of trade policy at all, or probably a mention, and you talk about a little bit about tariffs, a little bit about exchange rates. But the big thing that happens, you see, during this time is also economic integration. There are two aspects of trade policy, you see, that were very, very significant when we talk about East Asia. One is the preferential or differential trade policy that they adopt in terms of differential tariffs for import of intermediate goods, the entire value chain participation being dependent on that. So it was FDI and trade policy, that is tariffs, that were preferential for a certain set of goods that allowed them to participate in that intensity or with that intensity in the most dynamic manufacturing sectors of their time, you see. The other was the preferential trading arrangements, which I don't find a mention of at all in the book, And I'm surprised at that, because that is something that at least India has picked up in the last couple of years. It's something that East Asia was doing in the early 1990s. I mean, the first brand-to-brand complementarity scheme that you see of Thailand and Japan in automobiles is what really pushed automobiles as far as Thailand's place in the world in the automobile sector is concerned. None of this finds a place in the book, you see. So, I mean, this is not to say that the book doesn't have all the pieces. No book can have everything. As you say at the end, I think there is a Ghalib couplet that you have put in, you see, at the end, which is to say that, although you wish for many, you don't achieve everything. I would say you can't get, as they say, किसी को भी पूरा आसमान नहीं मिलता, किसी को ज़मीन तो किसी को आसमान, something of that sort. I mean, I hope. But so I looked for many things as far as manufacturing sector is concerned. I understand that for one single book, it's not possible to include just about everything. And as I said, I compliment the authors. You see, two different people, two different streams, having experienced that most recently in having co-edited a book most recently. I know how it is to gel two minds together to bring out a book, you see. So I congratulate once again, compliment you on what has been accomplished. But I can't help saying, you see, that the big missing piece as far as India's growth trajectory is concerned, in terms of what we've missed out as far as what others did, participation in intermediate goods trade, economic integration, preferential trading arrangements and agreements, I think deserved a place in the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amita. I know that formally we have run out of time, but I hope that people have time to stay to listen to some responses and maybe have a bit of audience interaction afterwards. Devesh, Arvind, clearly your book is too short. You didn't have enough on global value chains, on the integration, especially with respect to intermediate inputs, and perhaps something also on the point about the lack of correlation between growth and employment and what that foretells for the future.
So first of all, Shankar and Amita, thanks for absolutely great comments, very, very thoughtful, and will make us think, certainly when we try and think about what we missed out on. Let me say first, when Shankar spoke about the untapped benefits of trade and globalization and our inadequacy, and see, I think this kind of connects both these things. So we had one chapter on globalization, right? Because we had to do so many other things. And remember, in that chapter, we not only cover trade, but also capital flows and FDI. And so we had to say, what is it that we can offer new in terms of this? And so the two themes of that chapter are, and the two questions we ask are, why, despite, there've been 3 random natural experiments on trade and openness, all pointing to, the successful outcomes. The planning era, closed, poor performance; the neoliberal era, open performance. And then we also show that, if you look at the state level, those states that have been more exposed to globalization are actually the most successful states. So the puzzle we take up and we kind of try and partially answer is exactly what you said, that why, despite all these successes, do we remain ambivalent about trade? And that's one of the themes of that chapter. We offer explanations which we can go into, but just to exemplify, the thing like we like to say is that, history is important because you have to learn from your mistakes. But for God's sake, we didn't even learn from our successes, let alone our mistakes. And the two manifestations, after 2017, we turned protectionist once again, despite the evidence of this. And, we started imposing these horrendous quality control orders. No, 2018 began just as I was leaving, so don't blame me for that. And also remember, the other side is that the Congress Party, which was kind of the steward of all of this, oversaw all this in its campaign manifestos, etc., has very little on this. It's all about redistribution. So it is a puzzle. We have some explanations for that, but it's very much a theme of the book. Now, on I think Amita's point, and I'll come to the last, agree that we don't actually address the whole global value chain issue. You're absolutely right. But I don't think we do focus a lot on India's global export market share and not just rate of growth, and say how much we underperformed. And also, one of the puzzles we raise also is, why were we so ambivalent on trade policy, that we were amongst the most protectionist and so on. But one of the, I would say, highlight, this is not I think mea culpa to saying we don't go into global value chains, but what we do in the book, which I think is somewhat new perspective, is we say, let's look at this whole trade performance not just in terms of trade in goods, but trade in migration and trade in services. In fact, if you look at the chapter, when we talk about the underperformance relative to India's endowment of unskilled labor, we actually have new measures of how much even if you take into account how much labor migration that happened and the services exports that we do. And we have a chart showing how, of all the countries, we have underperformed most, not just in the narrower trade sense, but in the much broader sense of not utilizing our unskilled labor potential. So we don't address that, but we try and actually do something broader and speak about how we've underexploited that. Last thing, I think Shankar's point, so the growth and the correlation, it's a great point. And I'll tell you why. We do devote a whole chapter to say, why did we get growth but not employment and structural transformation? And chapter 5 is based on that. We can discuss that, why that's the case. But I think it's absolutely true that we don't actually ask the reverse question of, how come if you didn't get formal employment, we got so much growth for so long? And I think that's a very fair comment. Yeah, no, that I can see. My kind of tentative answer to that would be that, with growth, you get some trickle down, which is what gives you the poverty reduction and the so you get more employment, but not formal. You get more informal employment, higher wages, and we do have data showing wages do go up, and that affects poverty. So it's still possible to get trickle down, higher wages, etc., improving prospects at the bottom. But I think the core question of we don't have a really good explanation for your puzzle, and that's a great point actually.
So just a small comment on Amita's saying that, how come you guys managed to pull off a large book? Well, actually, we first had a contract with Harvard University Press. The thing is that it's not just a large book, but publishers have severe limits now on the number of drafts you can and tables. And our book is full of that. So they said you can only, once we send them the first draft, they said you have to cut down words and this. We said no. Then Princeton University gave us a contract. They said, no problems, we'll run it. When they saw the draft, they got scared. They said, you have to cut. We said no. The usual thing for academics is Harvard, Princeton University Press are the prestige names. We said, we don't want prestige. We want the book we want to write. And that's how we came to a trade press, which is HarperCollins. That's the story.
No, but we also have an academic press which is bringing out the international edition, which did not, Oxford University Press, which didn't impose any limits on words. So
that's the story. Now, I think your point on the nature of the state, it's the tendency to control, the complexity, the corruption, the limited competence. We try, but probably haven't succeeded. Right. Yeah, so the explanation, this is where I think we point out what the democracy gives and what it takes away. You cannot, a fundamental sine qua non of democracy is elections. You cannot have elections without money. That is not just an Indian problem, it's a global. And we know that the need to get election finance, and I have a whole book on this, is not the only, but it's an important reason behind corruption. One of the interesting things of the Indian Constitution, it doesn't have the word political part in it. A small-scale enterprise has more rules than a political party, just in terms of accounts, annual accounts, you have to submit all of that. And that complete lack of governance of political parties, along with the insatiable, and we show just how frequent, how many elections are taking place in India all the time, and the constant demand for money to finance them is surely an important part of the story. The same with, on the competence of the state, we show that right from the 50s, every decade reports are saying, for God's sake, the one bane of Indian public administration has been transfers. So there's this poignant World Bank report. The World Bank made like 18 railway loans to India. And each time they would come, the managers they were negotiating had gone. So the guys, are doing back to office reports, we have to start all over again. Each time we have to negotiate with a different person, begin all over again. And they're pleading with the government, just leave these guys in place for a few years. So we show that from the BDO to the police person and now judges, every aspect of the Indian state. We show that at the district level, where a BDO, SDO, a Tehsildar and the DM constitute the development machinery. In almost nowhere do these four people stay in the same district for even a year. So coordination just becomes much, much harder. Now, we don't have a good explanation why. We know that politics plays a role in transfers, money plays a role in transfers, but it's hard to quantify that. On education, you're absolutely right that why one of the things we find actually, what the literature shows surprising, universal primary education does not occur in democracies. It occurs in authoritarian systems. The expansion of primary education in the US and the West occurred before universal franchise, not after it. And of course, because we got it early, that might have. But of course, we know, as you know, Marion Wiener's famous book, The Child and the State, India's social hierarchy, the caste system, all of those things have played a role. But it's also a thing that we point out that certain public goods, in particular, like education, health, sanitation, and Eleanor Ostrom's work, these are co-produced between state and society. Right? A child's education is not just in the classroom, it's also at home. And if so, much of this also reflects not just the state's failure, but social failures as well. And we should be very clear that there are severe weaknesses, which we are all aware of in the Indian society, that get reflected in some of these outcomes. I think I'll just turn and just a minute on higher education. We found that 100 years ago, in the 1920s, when India's literacy rate was in single digits, India already had more college graduates than France. And those reports are pointing out, which continue, we argue, that one of the most severe distortions in Indian labor markets, which has contributed in higher education, is the government labor market, where tens of millions of kids take these exams for years to end, where the probability of getting a government job is less than 1%, right? Today and in the last 10 years, India is a complete outlier in its high gross enrollment ratio in higher education relative to its per capita income. It has way over invested in terrible higher education relative to its income. Just to give you one number and I'll stop. In the last quarter century, India opened more than 4 colleges a day, every day, including weekends, in the last quarter century. Now ask yourself, who do you think are the faculty? What exactly are they learning? And what exactly are we doing?
Just to add a couple of things to what Devesh said, on the education point, and this brings out one of the themes of the book, is that, many of the failures on health, education, etc., happened where the subject matter was the purview of the states, not the center. Not just the center. And in fact, the improvement in education that happened in the late 1990s happened as a result of the center saying, we will centralize, and starting some of these CSS like Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan. So when we look at some of the failures of India, we should look not just at the center, but at the states. And as Devesh said, not just with the state as capital S, but also with society. Last point I would say is on, you said complexity. We say that if my Bapism is the default ideology shared across the board, complexity is the standard operating procedure, right? And we can trace many, I think it's been a real curse and a real pain. I'll just say one thing, just to make this brief. So we describe the fertilizer subsidy regime, and say this is how industrial licensing happened, and we write about it in the past tense. And then we shock the reader and say, this is not the fertilizer regime of 1970 or 1980 or 1990 or 2010. It is the fertilizer regime today, 2024. As Faulkner said, the past is never dead. It is not even past.
Thanks so much. If you have time for a few questions from the audience, maybe I can kick things off. Arvind, the last thing you talked about was very interesting, which is that some of the advances in education are coming from centralization. But one of the things I wanted to ask you was about the notion of competitive federalism and whether that's a good thing, whether that's a bad thing, how it's working in India. The US famously has this idea that states are the laboratories of experimentation. In Europe, when Christopher Columbus failed to get sponsorship from one European monarch, he could hop across and get sponsorship from a neighboring monarch. So what is your view of competitive federalism? What does it portend for the future? Before you answer that, let me also go to the audience and see if people have questions. Sound?
Thank you. I haven't read the book, so I don't know whether you have covered this. But in your opinion, has Jugaad hindered or helped the Indian growth process?
Yeah.
So this is question to Dr. Arvind Subramanian. Uh, in 2006, you, along with other colleagues from the IMF, Raghuram, Raju Sahab, and Kalpana and other colleagues, you did mention about India's pattern of development, what happened and what follows. So that was 2006. This book I haven't read. So in 2025, did you predict what was going to follow over the last 20 years? Where do you see this book taking stock of on how, as Shankar Sahab mentioned, that the future looks bleak, not in so much terms, but where do you see that where we are, our trajectory moving forward next 2 decades?
Let's take maybe one more question.
Again, I have also not read the book, but I have one question. We will definitely. You mentioned about the fertilizer policy. So can you also share share some insights on the China's fertilizer policy and how the evolution happened there?
I think that way I like to put it is that all the gods of all the religions, even if they get together and see this, they would say, bend, genuflect at the altar of the Indian state and say, to see great ho.
Please, Devesh, Arvind.
So about going forward, the book does not make any prescriptions, period. But one, we can all have prescriptions. We all have them. I'm sure we can all come up with a list. There's nothing particularly fresh we have. We just have one prescription at the very last chapter. We say that, policymakers should sometimes think of the equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. I think in doing research for this book, looking around the world, it really struck us just how fragile nation building can be. And I don't think so. We know how good we've had and how fragile it can be. So that is a plea to political leadership, policymakers, be careful, handle with care.
I mean, just to substantiate what he's saying, that, the fragility of this, we just have to look at our neighborhood and see, almost every instability in every part. And going back in time, the former Soviet Union, Pakistan, Sudan, Nigeria, Yugoslavia, Myanmar, that the comparative perspective, which is necessary not just to understand our failures, but also to understand our successes, which are unheralded and underappreciated. And as Devesh said, I mean, how fragile this can be and how we should be careful about not undermining that. Competitive federalism, I think absolutely, highly desirable. Competitive federalism is definitely, as you yourself said, the way China, many of the things were, provinces would experiment and others would have. And in India, I think also, if you look, certainly in the period of the 2000s and things, Nano says we'll go to West Bengal, but they didn't, whatever problems. In the old socialist era, that probably would have died. But then we had, lots of examples. The power sector is very bad generally, but there's some very good examples. Even in the power sector, Gujarat, for example, has done very well. My pet peeve now, when earlier we would say, India cannot do manufacturing, and something that Amita also said, but now that excuse is no longer there, because Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh are attracting some of this, even this electronics investment, and therefore what should be done to this? See, but again, let's be a bit careful, because there are at least two manifestations of competitive federalism that are also happening. One is you get competitive populism from competitive, you give 1,000, I'll give 2,000, I'll give 5,000. And by the way, the point that Devesh mentioned about how important elections are for corruption, we show in the book that in the 50s to 80s, the average gap between elections was almost 5 years. Today, the average gap between elections is 1.2 years. So it's like you've done one and you're on the next cycle, because as you know, there's the third tier, the fourth, the urban, rural, et cetera, et cetera. But that's one downside of competitive federalism. The other, which I mean, because I work with some of the states, I see that you are getting race to the bottom policies as well. That, states are going overboard in terms of industrial policy and giving all kinds of things that, this is a deep insight on the GST that I got. I didn't, it's not my insight, but a politician, a Gujarat cadre officer told me why Gujarat opposed the GST. It's a really deep insight, is that, in the pre-GST era, one of the way you gave benefits for investors is by not having this sales tax VAT. To not impose this was the lure for investors. And with the GST, by definition, he was forced. You couldn't give that, and that's it. So it was a good aspect of GST that it would prevent race to the bottom kind of politics. But of course, now even that is being eroded. So competitive federalism, again, like everything, is very important, but it also has downsides. The last thing on the paper, I don't know much about Jugaad. Maybe Devesh is, the obvious answer to Jugaad is Jugaad is third best, fourth best, fifth best, but we shouldn't be in a situation where, you get into the third. If you're always operating in the fifth and sixth best, there's a problem with the economy, right? That we're not doing that. And the last thing on the question of the 2006 paper and things, I think that, that pattern that we outlined has only continued, has not been reversed. But I will say that I've been a little bit, in that paper, I know that I was a little bit breathless and overdid the opportunities afforded by services alone. I thought services, there would be much more, spread and so on. But I think that optimism was overstated, and, we've not got structural transformation because of that pattern of economic development.
Okay, let's bring this to a close. Thank you all very much, to our guests, to the audience. I know we went over, we did 1.5 hours. But given the vast intellectual terrain that we actually covered, I think the sort of, miles per minute were pretty good. Thank you very much.